My name is Josephine Merrick, and I am 71 years old. 6 weeks after I buried my husband, I sat in a lawyer's office and watched my two children divide $4.2 million between them in under an hour. They split the accounts, they split the cabin at the lake, they split the cars, the boat, the stocks, the life insurance, all of it, line by line, the way you split a check when you have already decided who ate more. And when it was done, when the big numbers had all found a home, the attorney slid one plain white envelope across the table to me. No dollar figure on it, just my name in my husband's handwriting, Josephine. My daughter in law looked at that envelope and actually smiled. She said, "Let mom keep that one, we will handle the real assets." My son laughed a little under his breath and said, "The house is too much for her anyway. We already talked to someone about listing it in the spring." The real assets. They said it right in front of me, like I was a coat rack in the corner of the room. They had spent 45 minutes carving up $4.2 million, and they handed the widow one envelope, and they thought that was the end of it. Here is what none of them knew. I kept the books for that family for 31 years. Every contract, every payroll run, every loan, every dollar that came in and out of the company my husband built with his own two hands, I recorded it. They forgot that. Arthur did not. And that envelope in front of me was not a consolation prize. The attorney looked at me over her glasses and said one quiet thing before we started. She said, "Josephine, whatever you do, open yours last." So I did. I let them take their millions first. I let my son sign for his share, and my daughter-in-law take pictures of the lake deed on her phone, and everyone shake hands and talk about closure. And then, when the room had almost emptied, I opened the envelope. 4 hours later, my son was on the phone with a bank, white as the tablecloth, trying to explain how he had promised a buyer something that had never once belonged to him. But I am getting ahead of myself. Before I take you back, let me ask you something. If you are watching this, do me a small favor. Hit that like button and subscribe, because stories like this one only find the people who need them when you do. And leave me a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is where you sit right now. I read them. I read every single one, usually in the morning with my coffee, in a kitchen that is very quiet now. And if you have ever been the one everybody underestimated, the one they talked over and planned around, stay with me. Because I need to take you back to the beginning, back to a man named Arthur and a shop on Depot Street and a marriage that lasted 49 years. Back to the years everything was built, and then the months it was all quietly aimed at when my husband was still alive and already knew what our children would do the moment he was gone. Let me start where it really starts, with a lumber yard and a boy with sawdust in his hair and a girl who was faster than the register. Arthur and I met in 1972 in a town called Alder Creek, Pennsylvania. He was 24 and I was 21. He had a way of measuring a board twice before he ever picked up a saw. I was the girl at the front counter of the lumber yard where he bought his supplies, and I could add a column of numbers in my head faster than the machine could. He noticed that before he noticed anything else about me. He used to say he married me for my arithmetic and stayed for the rest. We opened Merrick Millwork the year after we married. Custom cabinetry, built-ins, staircases, the kind of careful woodwork that people stopped paying for somewhere around 1990 and then started paying for again when they realized what they had lost. Arthur built the pieces. I built the business. That is the part nobody in my family ever wanted to say out loud, so I will say it for them. For 31 years, I did the books for Merrick Millwork. I did payroll, I chased the invoices, and I fought the suppliers, and I sat across from the loan officer at Alder Creek Savings and made him blink first. When we had a bad quarter, I was the one who moved money around, so the men still got paid on Friday. When we had a good year, I was the one who decided how much to put back into the shop and how much to keep for a rainy day. I did not have a title. Women of my generation in a town like ours did not get titles. I had a metal desk in the back office behind the showroom, a green ledger, and a locked drawer, and I ran that company's money for 3 decades while my husband ran its heart. Let me tell you about the fire because it tells you who I am better than anything else I could say. In the spring of 1994, the spray booth in the back of the shop caught an electrical thing, nobody's fault, and it took the finishing room and 2 weeks of work and very nearly the whole building. Arthur stood in the parking lot at 2 in the morning and watched the fire trucks, and I watched him age 5 years in an hour. He thought we were finished. The insurance was going to be slow, the men needed paychecks, and we had 3 jobs due that we could no longer finish on time. And I sat at that metal desk the next morning with the green ledger and the phone, and I did what I do. I called the insurance company and I did not let them off the phone until I had a partial advance. I called the bank and I got a short bridge loan against the equipment that survived. I called every one of those 3 customers myself and I told them the truth, and I offered them a fair discount for their patience, and I kept all 3. And I made payroll that Friday. Every man got his check. Not one of them ever knew how close it came, because a good office manager, like a good roof, is only noticed when she fails. Arthur knew. Arthur never once forgot who kept the lights on that year. The trouble is that he was the only one. To everyone else, I was the pleasant woman in the cardigan who brought coffee to the showroom and kept the calendar. Suppliers who had spoken to me on the phone for years would come in and shake Arthur's hand and ask him about the accounts, and he would say, "You will want to talk to Joe about that," and you could watch them not quite believe him. I got used to it. You get used to being looked through. You tell yourself it does not matter as long as the work gets done, and mostly you believe it, and once in a great while, late at night, you do not. We raised two children in the house on Depot Street, a white four-bedroom with black shutters that Arthur added onto himself, one room at a time, as the family grew. Daniel came first in 1979. Corinne came 3 years later. Daniel was the one who wanted the shop. From the time he was tall enough to hold a broom, he was out there sweeping shavings and asking Arthur how much a job cost and how much we kept. Not how it was made, how much we kept. I noticed that early, and I did not let myself think too hard about it. He was a boy. Boys are allowed to like money. I told myself he would grow into the craft the way his father had, that the love of the wood would come. It never quite did. He learned enough to sound like he knew, which is a different and more dangerous thing. Corinne was the opposite. She was quiet like me, a reader, a girl who kept to the edges of a room and saw everything from there. She did not want the shop. She wanted out of Alder Creek, and she got out to a marketing job 2 hours away and a husband named Paul and a daughter named Emmy, who is the best thing this family ever made. I will tell you more about Emmy later. She matters more than the money. Daniel stayed. He went to the community college for 2 years for business, and then he came into the company, and Arthur was so proud he could hardly stand it. His son coming into the business. That is a dream for a man like Arthur. I wanted it to be a dream too. For a while it was. Then Daniel married Sloane. I want to be fair about Sloane, so I will tell you the good first. She is smart, she is organized, she can walk into a room and know within a minute who has the power and who does not, and she never wastes a word on the ones who do not. The trouble was that from the day she married my son, she looked at me and decided I was one of the ones who did not. She met a small town woman in a cardigan who baked and kept a garden and never raised her voice. She did not meet the woman who had kept that company solvent through 2 recessions and a fire in the spray booth. Nobody told her that woman existed because nobody in my family ever really believed she did, not even my son, especially not my son. Sloane had ideas about the business from the start: expand, borrow, buy the empty lot out on the highway and triple the floor space, bring in the cheaper imported blanks and cut the hand joinery that took Arthur's men 3 times as long, grow it, package it, and someday sell it to somebody bigger for a number with a lot of zeros. Arthur listened to all of it politely and did almost none of it. He was not against growing, he was against becoming something he would not want to buy from. And every year Sloane grew a little more impatient with the old man who would not get out of the way. I remember one Thanksgiving, maybe 5 years back, when she cornered me in my own kitchen while I basted the turkey. She said, "Josephine, you could help us, you know." She said, "Arthur listens to you. If you told him it was time to modernize, to think about the future, he would hear it from you." I wiped my hands on my apron and I said, "Sloane, Arthur has been thinking about the future since before you were born. That is why the doors are still open." She smiled the way you smile at a slow child, and she went back to the dining room, and I understood that she had just filed me the same way I file invoices, under not useful. I saw it building for years, the way you see weather coming over the ridge before anyone else does. I did not say much. I have found that a woman who says little gets to hear a great deal. So I heard. I heard Daniel and Sloane at Sunday dinners talking about the company like it was already theirs, like Arthur and I were tenants they were being kind to. I heard them use the phrase "when the time comes," which is what people say when they mean when you are dead. I heard, and I filed it away, the same way I filed every invoice for 31 years. Quietly, completely. And I said nothing, because I was still hoping I was wrong. The turn came in the spring, 2 years ago, when Arthur got his diagnosis: pancreatic. If you know that word, you already know how this part goes. There is not a lot of runway with that one. The doctor gave us a year, and we got about 14 months, and I would not trade a day of it, hard as some of those days were. We spent that time the way you do, slowly and then all at once. But something happened in the first month after the diagnosis that I did not fully understand until this year, and I need to tell you about it now, because it is the hinge the whole story turns on. Arthur asked me to drive him to see Marion Cole. Marion had been our attorney for almost 30 years. She did our first incorporation papers, our deeds, our wills, all of it. She is close to my age, silver haired, sharp as a tack, the kind of lawyer who says less than she knows and knows almost everything. I assumed we were going to update the wills. That is what you do when the news is bad. You put the papers in order. So I sat in Marion's waiting room with a magazine I did not read, and Arthur went in alone, and he was in there for almost 2 hours. When he came out, he looked tired and strangely settled, like a man who had set down something heavy. On the drive home, I asked him what took so long. He put his hand over mine on the seat and he said, "I took care of us, Joe." I asked him what that meant. He looked out the window at the shop as we passed it, the sign he painted himself, Merrick Millwork, established 1973, and he said, "It means that whatever happens, you will never have to ask any of them for anything." I did not understand. I thought he meant the will. I thought he meant he had left me the house and enough to live on, which is what a good husband does. I did not know that afternoon that my husband had just spent 2 hours quietly rebuilding the entire ground under our family, so that when the storm came, I would be standing on stone and everyone else would be standing on sand. He went back a second time 3 weeks later, and a third time in the summer, and each time he told me it was nothing, just details, just an old man being careful. He never told me the details. That was very like him. He carried it alone the same way he carried everything, so I would not have to. All he said more than once in those 14 months was the same short sentence. When the time comes, let Marion handle it. And whatever they say, open yours last. I thought it was just a tired man being cryptic. I know better now. The sickness did what it does. Arthur got thinner. The shop saw less of him, and then it saw none of him, and Daniel started signing things he used to hand to his father. I understood that. The work had to go on. Men had families, orders had deadlines, somebody had to run the floor, and Daniel was the natural choice, and I did not fight it because Arthur did not fight it. But something changed in my son during those months, and it was not grief, it was appetite. He started calling the company his little things at first: my shop, my guys, my accounts. He stopped saying Dad's business and started saying the business like he had built it himself. And within a few weeks, my shop started to change in ways that had nothing to do with keeping the doors open. He hired a consultant, a young man in a slim suit named Bryce, who came in with a laptop and a slideshow and words like efficiency and right sizing, and who had clearly never sanded a board in his life. Bryce did a study. The study said Merrick Millwork was, quote, leaving margin on the table by insisting on hand joinery and domestic hardwood. The study recommended imported components and I am quoting the slide, a leaner labor model. A leaner labor model. That is consultant for firing men who have given you 20 years. I only knew about any of it because Hector Ruiz called me at home one evening, quiet and careful, the way a proud man is when he is scared. Hector had been with Arthur for 22 years. He said, "Mrs. Merrick, I do not want to worry you with Mr. Arthur so sick, but there is talk on the floor. They are saying half of us will not be here by summer." I told Hector to keep his head down and keep building the right way and that I would look into it. And I hung up the phone and I sat in the dark for a while because there was not much I could do, not yet, not while it was still, on paper, my son's to run. So I did the only thing I could do. I remembered. I wrote down the date and what Hector told me and the consultant's name in the back of the green ledger, in pencil, the way I have recorded everything for 50 years. I did not know yet what I was building. I only knew that I was going to have every fact when the day came that facts would matter. And Sloane, who had waited a long time for this exact season, went to work. She started showing up at the house more, always with a reason, to bring soup, to sit with Arthur so I could rest, which I appreciated. I will not pretend I did not. But she never just sat. She wandered. She opened cabinets and looked at the good china and asked what year we bought the dining set. One afternoon, I came in from the garden and found her in the front hall with her phone held up, and when I asked what she was doing, she smiled and said she was just taking some pictures for insurance purposes. For insurance purposes. My husband was dying in the back bedroom, and my daughter-in-law was photographing my house. I did not say a word. I filed it. There was a worse afternoon, and I have to tell you about it because it is the one I still see when I close my eyes. It was late September, and Arthur was having a good day, which by then meant a day he could sit up in his chair for a few hours. Daniel and Sloane came by, and Sloane had that leather folder under her arm, and I felt the temperature of the room change the moment she set it on the table. She said they had brought some paperwork, just some things to make life simpler, so that if Arthur ever, and she let the sentence trail off the way people do when they mean if you die. She slid a document across to Arthur. It was a power of attorney. It would have given Daniel authority over Arthur's affairs, all of them, effective immediately, quote, to reduce the burden on you both. And there was a second page under it, folded back, that she did not mention, and I only saw the top of it, but the top of it said, transfer of membership interest. Arthur did not have his glasses on. Sloane knew he did not have his glasses on. She had a pen out already, uncapped, the way you hand a pen to a man you have decided is too tired to read. And I said, from the doorway, Arthur, would you like me to get your glasses? That was all. Would you like me to get your glasses? And my husband, sick as he was, looked up at me, and then he looked at Sloane, and then he looked at the pen. And he smiled a small, tired smile, and he said, No, Joe, I do not think I will be signing anything today. Put it away for now, Sloane. There is no rush. Sloane put the pen down and put the folder away, and said, Of course, no rush at all. But her jaw was tight the rest of the visit, and after they left, Arthur reached for my hand, and he said the thing again, quieter than ever. He said, When the time comes, Joe, open yours last. I said I would. I did not know what I was promising, I only knew I would keep it. The first time somebody said the quiet part out loud was at Thanksgiving, the last one, about 6 weeks before he passed. I hosted because I always host, because a table is one of the few things a dying man can still enjoy. I cooked for 11 for 2 days, and when everyone sat down, Sloane had rearranged my table. She had put her own mother at the foot, in the seat by the window that had been Arthur's carving seat for 40 years, because Arthur was too weak to carve, and she said it seemed a shame to leave it empty. And she put me down at the end by the kitchen door, the seat you give the person who is expected to get up and fetch things. I got up and fetched things. 9 times I counted, out of habit, the way I count everything. 9 times I rose from that table in my own dining room to bring gravy and refill water and find the serving spoon that somehow was never where anyone else could reach it. And late in the meal, Daniel raised his glass and made a toast. He toasted new beginnings. He toasted the future of the family and the business. He said, We have a lot of exciting changes coming, and I know Dad is proud. And he looked at his father, and Arthur, who could barely lift his fork, said nothing, because there was nothing left in him to fight with. And Sloane's mother, who I had met perhaps 3 times, patted my hand and said, Josephine, you must be so relieved that the young people are ready to take it all over. So relieved. I said the turkey was a little dry this year, and I went to check on the pie that did not need checking. I stood in my kitchen, my own kitchen, and I looked out the window at the maple, bare now, the last leaves gone, and I did the math one more time. Because a woman who is planning to move you out of your house before your husband is even in the ground has already decided what she thinks is coming to her, and people who are that sure they have already won get careless. I decided, standing at that sink, that I was going to let them be careless. I was going to be exactly the small, sad, agreeable widow they expected. And I was going to watch and wait and remember what Arthur said. Open yours last. There is one more thing from those last weeks I have to tell you, because it turned out to matter more than I understood at the time. About a month before Arthur died, I had to drive to Corliss for a doctor's appointment of my own, the kind you keep quiet so nobody worries. And after, I stopped at a restaurant off the highway to eat something before the drive home, a place I never go. And there, in a back booth, was my son Daniel, in a jacket and tie on a Wednesday afternoon, leaning across the table toward a man I had never seen. A man in an expensive coat, older, silver at the temples, with a leather portfolio open between them and papers spread across the table. Daniel did not see me. I did not go over. I sat at the counter with my back to them, and I ate my soup, and I listened to the low hum of a deal being made, though I could not hear the words. And when I left, I saw a business card lying on the edge of their table, and I have very good eyes, and it said Ostrander Capital Partners. I wrote that down too, in the green ledger that night. Ostrander. I did not know what it meant. I only knew my son was meeting a man in an expensive coat about something, a month before his father died, and that he had worn a tie to do it. Let me pause here for just a moment. If any of this is landing a little too close to home, if you have ever had family circle you like this, drop a single word in the comments just so I know you are out there. This next part is the hardest thing I have ever had to sit through, and it helps to know I am not telling it to an empty room. Arthur died on a Tuesday in November at home, in the bed we had shared for 49 years, with my hand in his and the last of the afternoon light coming in off the maple in the front yard. I will not spend long on that day. Some things belong to me and not to a story. I will only say that he was not afraid, and that the last full sentence he said to me was, Do not let them rush you, Joe. Then he squeezed my hand once, and a little while later, he was gone. The funeral was on a Saturday. Half the town came. Arthur had built cabinets in a good number of those houses, and hung doors, and fixed things he never charged for, and it showed in who filled that church. His men from the shop sat together in the back in their good shirts, and one of them, Hector Ruiz, cried harder than any of us. Remember Hector, he matters later. Daniel gave the eulogy. I will give him this. He spoke well. He talked about his father's hands and his father's word, and how a Merrick handshake still meant something in this county. And then, 3 sentences from the end, he said something that made the back of my neck go cold. He said, Dad built something that is going to be in this family for generations, and I intend to make him proud of what it becomes. What it becomes. At his father's funeral, my son was already talking about what he was going to turn the company into. Sloan, in the front pew beside me, in a black dress I was fairly sure was new, nodded like he was reading scripture. Corinne, on my other side, reached over and squeezed my hand, and I held on to that. My daughter was the only one of them who spent that whole week asking how I was, and not once asking about a single thing that Arthur owned. I want you to hold on to that too. It gets important. The week after the funeral, the calls started. Not calls to see if I was eating, calls about the estate. Daniel called Monday and asked, very casually, if I knew where Dad kept the business paperwork, the incorporation stuff, the ownership records. I said Marion had all of it. There was a pause on the line, a pause I have thought about many times since. And he said, right, Marion, and something in his voice told me he did not love that answer. Sloan called Wednesday to tell me she had, quote, taken the liberty of speaking with a realtor friend, just to understand the market, no pressure. No pressure. She had a comparative market analysis for my house before my husband's flowers had wilted. 14 Depot Street, 4 bedrooms, estimated at $390,000. She read me the number over the phone like it was a kindness. I thanked her. I filed it. And that same week, without telling anyone, I did the one thing that ended up mattering more than anything else I did. I drove to the bank, not Alder Creek Savings, where everyone knew me. The other one, 2 towns over, in Corliss, where Arthur and I had kept a safe deposit box for almost 40 years. There is a small brass key for that box that I keep on a blue ribbon in my jewelry drawer, and Sloan had asked me about it once, months earlier, what it opened, and I had told her, old papers, which was true and told her nothing. I signed in. The young man walked me back and left me alone with the box in a little room with a single chair, and I opened it. Inside were the things you would expect: our marriage certificate, Arthur's discharge papers, the original deed to the house. But there was something else in there that had not been there the last time I looked, something Arthur must have put in during one of the days I thought he was just running an errand. A single sheet of heavy paper, folded once with a certified stamp in the corner and Marion Cole's name at the bottom, and a sticky note on top in Arthur's shaky late handwriting. It said, Joe, this is the whole game. Do not show it to anyone until Marion tells you to. Trust me one last time. I read that sheet of paper standing up in that little room, and I had to sit down in the single chair when I was done, because I finally understood what my husband had done for me in Marion Cole's office, 2 hours at a time, while I sat in the waiting room thinking he was just updating a will. I am not going to tell you exactly what that paper said yet. I want you to feel it the way they felt it in the room when it landed. So I will just tell you that I put it back in the box, and I locked the box, and I drove home the long way, past the shop, past the church, past the little cemetery where the dirt on Arthur's grave was still dark. And for the first time since he got sick, I was not afraid. I put the brass key back on its blue ribbon, and I waited for Marion to call. While I waited, I did something I want you to understand, because it is the difference between a woman who gets lucky and a woman who is ready. I got ready. I pulled 31 years of records out of the locked drawer in the back office, not to plan revenge, to know exactly where I stood. I reread the loan documents on the spray line Daniel had signed in March, the one Sloan's consultant had pushed. I looked at the accounts and I saw where the money had gone in the last year, and I saw 2 payments to a firm called Bryce Advisory that made my jaw tighten, and I saw a retainer, a small one, paid in October, to a law office that was not Marion's. Daniel had hired his own lawyer, in October. While his father was still breathing, I wrote it all down: dates, amounts, names. Not because I was going to use it as a weapon, because Arthur taught me 50 years ago that a feeling will keep you up at night, but a fact will hold up in daylight. And I had a feeling something very large was coming. So I gathered my facts, and I stacked them neat, and I waited for the daylight. The reading of the estate was set for a Thursday, 10 days after the funeral, at 4 in the afternoon, in the conference room at Marion Cole's office on Main Street. I got there early. I always get there early. It is a habit from 31 years of meetings where I could not afford to look like I was scrambling. Marion met me at the door and walked me back herself, and before we went into the conference room, she stopped me in the hall and put her hand on my arm. She said, Josephine, they do not know. I asked her, know what? She said, any of it. Arthur wanted it that way. Today is going to be hard for about 40 minutes, and then it is going to be very different. Remember what he told you. Let them go first. Open yours last. I said I would. And then we went in. They were already there. Daniel in a suit I did not recognize, sitting at the head of the table like he had picked the seat on purpose, which I am sure he had. Sloane beside him with a leather folder and a gold pen, ready to take notes, ready to receive. Corinne across from them, in a soft gray sweater, looking like she would rather be anywhere else. And two people I had not expected. A man in his 50s in an expensive coat, and a younger woman with a briefcase. And I knew the man, not his face, but the coat. The expensive coat from the back booth of the restaurant off the highway in Corliss, Ostrander. Daniel introduced them fast, the way you introduce people you do not really want questioned. He said they were, quote, advisors, here to help make sure the transition went smoothly. Advisors. I said nothing. I sat in my seat with my hands folded, and I let my son believe I did not recognize the man he had been meeting for a month before his father was even sick enough to stop coming to the shop. Marian sat at the far end, opened a folder, and put on her glasses, and she began to read. She read the will first, the plain part, the part everyone expected. To my beloved wife Josephine, the house at 14 Depot Street and its contents. Sloane's pen paused over her folder when she heard the house go to me, and I watched her recalculate, and I watched her decide it did not matter because the house was going to get sold out from under me anyway. We had already discussed the senior community. Marian kept reading. The liquid estate, she said, the investment accounts, the retirement accounts, the life insurance, the vehicles, the boat, and the lake cabin, to be divided equally between my two children, Daniel Merrick and Corinne Merrick Ellison. And then she read it, item by item, and it took a long time, and it was meant to. The retirement accounts, $1.1 million. The investment portfolio, $1.6 million. The life insurance, $500,000. The lake cabin, appraised at $400,000. The boat, the two vehicles, a coin collection Arthur's father had left him. Line after line after line, and with each line I watched my son lean a little further forward, and I watched Sloane's gold pen move a little faster, and I watched the number climb. Then Marian read the total. The total value of the divided estate as of the date of death was approximately $4.2 million. I watched my son's face when he heard that number. I watched it the way you watch a sunrise, slowly, taking in every change of color. $4.2 million, split two ways, was more money than Daniel had ever had his hands on in his life. And I could see him doing the same math I had done. And I could see the disappointment underneath the greed because $2.1 million was a lot. But it was not the company. It was not the shop. It was not the thing he had been calling mine for 14 months. He leaned forward and he asked the question he had come to ask. He said, Marian, that is the personal estate. What about the business? What about Merrick Millwork? And Marian looked at him over her glasses, calm as a Sunday, and said, we will get to that. Then she reached into her folder and took out one plain white envelope, and she slid it down the length of that long table until it stopped in front of me, my name on the front, in Arthur's hand. Josephine. And she said, Josephine, this is yours. I would like you to open it last, after we have finished everything else. Sloane looked at the envelope. She looked at me. And she smiled that smile, the one I had watched her practice on a dying man for a year. She said, let Mom keep that one. It is probably a letter. It will mean the world to her. She said, we can handle the real assets. The real assets. Daniel actually chuckled. He said, yeah, Mom, do not worry about the business side. That was never really your thing. He said the house is honestly too much for you anyway. We already talked to someone about listing it in the spring. We will find you somewhere easy. And there it was, 45 minutes into becoming millionaires, and they handed the widow an envelope and told her not to worry her head about the real assets. I looked down at that envelope with my name on it in my husband's shaking hand, and I did what Arthur told me to do. I set it down in front of me, unopened, and I folded my hands on top of it, and I said, of course, dear, you all go first. If you are still with me, and I hope you are, this is the part where I need you to do something for me. Take a breath. Because I sat in that chair, being called Mom in that tone, being told the business was never my thing, and I let every second of it happen. I have never in my life wanted to speak so badly, and I have never been so glad I stayed quiet. Let me tell you what they did with the next half hour, while my envelope sat there waiting. Daniel got right to it. He turned to Marian, and he said, all right, the personal estate is clear. Thank you. Now the company. Dad and I always understood that the business would come to me. I have been running it for over a year. The men answer to me. The accounts are in my name at the bank. He said, I have already begun the process of taking things to the next level, and I would like today to just formalize what everyone already knows. He said everyone already knows like it was a fact of physics. And then the man in the expensive coat, Grant Ostrander, cleared his throat and opened his mouth for the first time. He said, if it helps move things along, I can speak to the timeline. Mr. Merrick and I have a signed letter of intent. My group is prepared to acquire a majority stake in Merrick Millwork for a very strong valuation, and we are targeting a close within 60 days. So, really, the sooner the ownership is confirmed, the sooner everyone here benefits. And I felt the room tilt just slightly, the way it does right before you understand something large. My son had already sold the company, not part of it, a majority of it, to a stranger in an expensive coat for a valuation I had not heard yet, in a deal that was supposed to close in 60 days. He had signed a letter of intent to sell a company that he did not own one single share of. He had done it while his father was dying, and he had brought the buyer to the reading of the will to hurry the paperwork along. I looked at Corinne, and Corinne looked like she was going to be sick. This was news to her, too. Sloan was glowing. She had her gold pen out, and she was already writing, and I understood that this was the plan all along. The 4.2 million was the appetizer. Selling the company to Ostrander was the meal. They were going to take the money, sell the shop, cash Arthur's life's work out to a holding group that would move the work overseas and put the imported blanks in, and lay off Hector and every man who cried at that funeral. And they were going to move me to a patio in Brookline and call it taking care of Mom. Ostrander went on. He described the valuation, and when he said the number, I kept my face very still because the number was $26 million. $26 million. For the company, they had just handed me an envelope beside while they split the 4.2 like it was the fortune. He talked about synergies and offshore sourcing and a, quote, streamlined domestic footprint, which is a very clean way to say an empty building on Depot Street and 40 men in the unemployment line. Marion let them talk. That is the thing I have learned about Marion over 30 years. She lets people finish. She let Daniel lay out his plan, and she let Ostrander describe his timeline, and she let Sloan ask about the tax treatment of the sale proceeds, which she did, I promise you, before the ink was even imagined. Marion wrote nothing. She just listened, with her hands folded, until Daniel finally ran out of road and said, So, what do we need to sign to make the ownership official? And Marion took off her glasses. She said, Daniel, before you sign anything, and before Mr. Ostrander's group spends any more money on lawyers, there is one document we need to look at. She said, It changes the picture. She looked down the table at me and she said, Josephine, I think now is the time. Open yours. You kept all of us for a lot longer than that, and they forgot that too. I did not forget. So here is what I did, and I did it years ago, long before I got sick, because I saw it coming the way you always said I never did. Merrick Millwork does not belong to Daniel. It does not belong to me anymore either. 6 years ago, I moved the entire company, the shop, the land it sits on, the equipment, the name, and the 2 rental buildings on Depot Street into a holding trust, the Merrick Family Holding Trust. And I made you the sole trustee, and I made you the 80% owner. Not Daniel, you. The 4.2 million they are splitting today is real, and it is theirs, and I meant them to have it because they are still my children, and I love them even knowing what they are. But the company was never in that pile. The company was never theirs to sell. It is yours, Joe. It has been yours for 6 years. They just never thought to ask the quiet woman in the back office whose name was on anything. Do what you think is right with it. You always did. I love you. Open the rest with Marion. Arthur. The room was so quiet I could hear the clock in Marion's hall. Sloane's gold pen had stopped moving. Daniel's face had gone from confusion to something else, something I had not seen on my son since he was a boy who had broken a thing he could not fix. And Grant Ostrander, the buyer in the expensive coat, was looking back and forth between Daniel and Marion with the expression of a man who has just realized the deed he was handed came from someone who never held the keys. Marion slid the certified document to the center of the table so everyone could see it. She said, This is the certificate of trust. It was executed 6 years ago, properly witnessed, properly recorded. She said, Merrick Millwork, the operating company, the real estate on Depot Street, all of it, is held by the Merrick Family Holding Trust. The sole trustee, with full authority, is Josephine Merrick. The majority beneficial owner at 80% is Josephine Merrick. Daniel Merrick holds no ownership interest in the company, 0. She let that word sit there, 0. Then she turned to Ostrander and she said, Mr. Ostrander, I do not know what your letter of intent says, but I can tell you that the person who signed it had no authority to sell any part of this company, because he does not own any part of this company. Your agreement is with a man who was selling something that was never his. I would speak to your own counsel before you spend another dollar. Ostrander stood up. He did not even finish his water. He said something short and cold to Daniel about hearing from his attorney regarding the costs already incurred, and he and the young woman with the briefcase left, and the conference room door clicked shut behind them, and the sound of it was the loudest thing in the world, and then it was just family. Me, my son, my daughter-in-law, my daughter, and a document on the table that had quietly rearranged every single thing they thought they knew. Daniel found his voice first. It came out rough. He said, "This is not possible." He said, "I run that company. The bank accounts are in my name. I signed for the loan on the new spray line in March." And Marion, gentle but immovable, said, "You signed for that loan as an authorized officer, Daniel, because your mother, as trustee, authorized you to be one. She can unauthorize you just as easily. You have been running a company that you were allowed to run. That is a very different thing from owning it." I watched my son understand the difference, and it was not a kind thing to watch, and I want to be honest with you. Some small mean part of me had waited a long time for it. But most of me just felt tired and sad and strangely close to Arthur, who had built this shelter for me stone by stone and never once let me see him do it. Sloane recovered before Daniel did. She always does. She turned to me and the smile came back. A different smile now, a working smile, and she said, "Josephine, this is wonderful. Honestly, what a relief. Now everything stays in the family." She said, "Obviously, nothing really changes day to day. Daniel keeps running things. You can be, the owner on paper, and we all just continue on paper." There it was one more time. She had spent a year deciding I was a woman who existed on paper, a signature they needed, a formality between them and the money. And even now, even sitting 3 feet from a certified document that said I owned the thing she wanted most in the world, she could not stop herself from reaching for the pen. I looked at Sloane, and for the first time in the entire 14 months, I let her see the woman Arthur married. I said, "Sloane, I have done the books for that company for 31 years. I know what a good year looks like and what a bad one looks like. I know that the spray line loan Daniel signed in March was a bad deal at a bad rate that I would have stopped in an afternoon if anyone had thought to ask me. I know that you paid a consultant named Bryce $18,000 to tell my son to fire men who have given us their whole lives. I know exactly what Merrick Millwork is worth, better than the man in the expensive coat does, and it is a great deal more than $4.2 million, which is, I suspect, the whole reason we are all sitting here. Nothing about this is on paper. It is the most real thing in this room." And then I turned to my son, and this was the hardest part, harder than the envelope, harder than the funeral almost, because I do love him. That is the thing they never understand about a mother. You can see exactly what your child is and love him anyway, and it does not make you a fool, it makes you his mother. I said, "Daniel, you had a father who wanted nothing in this life so much as to hand you this company. All you had to do was be a man he could trust with it. That was the whole test. And you spent the last year of his life calling it yours and selling it to a stranger before he was cold." I did not raise my voice. I have never once raised my voice in a business meeting, and I was not going to start at the most important one of my life. I said, "You do not own Merrick Millwork. I do. And what happens to it next is going to depend entirely on the man you decide to be starting today." Then I folded Arthur's letter back along its crease and I slid it into the envelope with my name on it, and I put the envelope in my purse next to the little brass key on its blue ribbon. And I said, "Marion, I think we are done for today." But we were not quite done. Not the two of us. After the others filed out, Daniel first, Sloane close behind him with her folder held against her chest like a shield, and Corinne last, squeezing my shoulder as she passed, I stayed in that conference room a while longer. Just me and Marion and the certified document still sitting in the middle of the table. Marion poured me a cup of coffee from the pot on the side table. She sat down next to me, not across from me, next to me the way a friend does. And she told me the rest of what Arthur had done in those 2-hour visits I never understood. He had not just set up the trust 6 years ago. He had spent his last months making sure it was airtight, new witnesses, a fresh recording at the county office, and a plan for exactly this room, this afternoon, this order of events. Marion said, "He sat right where you are sitting, Josephine, back in October, when he could barely walk in from the car, and he made me promise 2 things, that I would let them go first, and that I would make you open yours last." She said, I asked him why. Why not just tell you everything and spare you the whole performance? And Arthur told her, "Because Jo has spent her whole life being told she does not understand the business. She needs to sit in that room and watch them prove, one more time, exactly how little they know, and then she needs to be the one holding the answer." He said, "She has earned the last word, and I am going to make sure she gets it. I sat in that quiet room and I let myself cry then, finally, the way I had not cried in front of any of them. Because my husband, dying in pain, had spent his last clear afternoons not on himself, but on building a single hour in which the woman he married would finally, publicly, be proven right. That is a love letter. Forget the envelope. The whole afternoon was the love letter. I asked Marion one thing before I left. I asked, did he suffer? Knowing what they would try, knowing his own son had a buyer in an expensive coat before the funeral. Marion was quiet for a moment. Then she said, no, Josephine. He did not suffer over it. He grieved it, which is different. And then he did something about it. That was always Arthur. He never once wasted his good energy being angry at a thing he could simply fix. I have tried to live by that this whole year. It has not been easy, but it has been right. Let me tell you what happened after, because the reading was not the end. The reading is where most of these stories stop, with the big reveal and the stunned faces. But the reveal is the easy part. What you do with the power after you have it, that is the part that tells you who you are. And I had 6 years of my husband's trust to live up to. The first thing that happened was that Grant Ostrander's group did exactly what he threatened. They sent a letter demanding that Daniel personally reimburse them for the legal and due diligence costs they had run up chasing a company he did not own. The number was $41,000. Daniel had signed the letter of intent in his own name. Personally, because he had been so sure, so certain the company was already his in everything but signature, that he had not bothered to protect himself. $41,000 out of his own 2.1 million gone before he had even finished celebrating the 2.1 million. He called me the night that letter came. It was the first time he had called me just to talk since before his father got sick, except he was not calling to talk. He was calling to see if the trust, meaning me, would cover the 41,000, since after all it was a business matter and I was the business now. I said no, I said it kindly, but I said no. I said, that bill is not the company's, Daniel. That bill is what it cost you to try to sell something that was not yours. You will pay it out of what your father left you, and you will learn what it feels like, and I hope it is the most educational $41,000 you ever spend. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised me. He said, does it make you happy, this? And I told him the truth. I said, no, none of this makes me happy, Daniel. I would trade every dollar of it to have your father back for one more Tuesday. What I am is clear, and clear is better than happy some days. He hung up without saying goodbye, and I let him because a grown man sometimes needs to sit in a thing without his mother rushing in to soften it. I had spent my whole life softening things for that boy. Not anymore. Sloane took a different approach. Sloane came to the house. She came on a Sunday, alone, with a coffee cake and a whole new demeanor, warm and folksy, a woman I had never met putting on the skin of a woman I might like. She sat at my kitchen table, the one Arthur built, and she told me how much she had always respected me. She used that word, respected, which was a word she had never once sent in my direction while my husband was alive. And then, slowly, gently, she got to it. She said maybe there was a way to structure things so that Daniel could buy into the company over time, earn some real ownership so the family could, quote, move forward as partners. She had a folder. Of course she had a folder. She always has a folder. She slid it across Arthur's table toward me, and it had little tabbed dividers, and it was a proposal, a whole proposal, for how I might transfer pieces of my company to my son and his wife in a tax-efficient way. I did not open the folder. I looked at it sitting there on the wood my husband had planed with his own hands, and I looked at Sloane, and I said, you photographed my house for insurance purposes. She blinked. She said, I am sorry. I said, back in the summer. When Arthur was dying, you stood in my front hall with your phone and you told me you were taking pictures for insurance purposes. You had a realtor's estimate on this house before the funeral. You had already picked out the senior community with the little patio. You put your own mother in Arthur's carving seat at his last Thanksgiving and me at the end by the kitchen door. I know exactly what you think of me, Sloane. You have shown me for years. I said, I am not angry. I am too old to spend my good years being angry. But I am not going to hand you in a kitchen what you tried to take from me in a conference room. The folder stays closed, and Sloane gathered up her coffee cake and her folder, and she left, and she has not been back to that kitchen since, and I have made my peace with that. Some doors you do not have to slam. You just stop holding them open. Now I want to tell you about Corinne, because this is where it turns, and I do not want you to think this whole story is just about people being terrible. My daughter called me the day after the reading, and she was crying. Not the performed kind, the real kind, the kind that comes out sideways in a voice that keeps breaking. She said, "Mom, I did not know about the buyer. I swear to you, I did not know Daniel was selling the company. I would have told you." And I believed her because I had watched her face in that conference room, and you cannot fake going that pale. She said, "I feel sick that I took the money, the 2.1 million. She said it felt dirty now, knowing what Daniel had been doing with the other hand. And I told my daughter something I want to tell you too, in case you need it. I said, Corinne, taking what your father freely left you is not the same as taking what was never yours. He wanted you to have that money. He said so in his letter. You did nothing wrong by receiving a gift. Your brother did something wrong by trying to steal one. Those are not the same, and I will not let you carry his weight." She cried a little more, and then she asked the question that told me she was still my Corinne. She asked, "Is Hector going to be okay? Are the men going to keep their jobs? Not what do I get, not what happens to me. Is Hector going to be okay?" And I said, "Yes, sweetheart. That is the first thing I am going to make sure of, because I had already decided." The Monday after the reading, I put on a good blouse and I drove down to Depot Street and I walked into the shop for the first time as the woman who owned it, and I called the men together on the floor in front of the big table saw under the sign Arthur painted. Some of them would not meet my eye at first. They had heard things. Small town, sick owner, a son with big plans, and a buyer in an expensive coat. They had been afraid for their jobs for months, and they had every reason to be. So I told them the truth, standing on the concrete floor Arthur poured in 1981. I said, "My name is Josephine Merrick, and I own this company. I have owned it quietly for 6 years, and I have kept its books for 31. And there is not a machine in this room whose payment history I could not recite from memory." I told them that Merrick Millwork was not for sale, not to Grant Ostrander, not to anyone. I told them the imported blanks were never coming in, and the consultant was gone, and we would build the way Arthur built, or we would not build at all. And I told Hector Ruiz, in front of everyone, that he was the new floor manager with the title and the raise that should have come to him 10 years ago, and that I would be relying on him the way Arthur had. Hector, who had cried at the funeral, cried again right there by the table saw, and he was not the only one. And I realized standing on that floor that I had a family after all. It was just not the one that showed up to divide the money. It was the one that showed up every morning at 7 and built beautiful things with their hands. I ran that company myself for the next 4 months, and I will not pretend it was easy at 71. I was in the back office by 7:30 most mornings at the metal desk with the green ledger open, and I fixed the things Daniel had bent. I renegotiated the spray line loan and saved us $9,000 a year. I called the 3 suppliers he had switched for cheaper ones, and I switched us back, and 2 of them dropped their price to keep us because they remembered doing business with me in the 90s and they knew I did not bluff. I sat across from a new loan officer at the bank, a young man half my age, and I made him blink first, the same as I had made his predecessor blink first 30 years ago. Word got around town, the way it does. Arthur Merrick's widow was running the shop herself, and she knew where every dollar was. Some people were surprised. The ones who had done business with me for 40 years were not surprised at all. They had always known. They were just glad the rest of the world was finally finding out. There is one afternoon from those 4 months I want to tell you about, because it is the one that told me I could really do this. About 3 weeks in, we nearly lost our biggest account. A builder named Tom Whitaker, who had been putting Merrick cabinets in his custom homes for 15 years, called the office in a state. He had heard, the way everyone hears in a town this size, that Merrick Millwork was being sold to some outfit that would move the work out of state. He had a development of 9 houses breaking ground in the spring, 9 full kitchens, the biggest single order the shop had seen in years, and he told me flat out he could not risk it on a company that might not exist by summer. He said, "Josephine, I am sorry, I loved Arthur, but I have my own people to protect." I did not argue with him, and I did not beg. I have never once landed an account by begging. I asked him to come down to the shop and see it for himself before he decided. He came the next morning, and I walked Tom Whitaker across that floor, past Hector cutting dovetails by hand, past the drying racks and the good domestic maple stacked to the ceiling. I told him exactly who owned this company and how long and what was and was not for sale. I told him the imported blanks were never coming. I told him I had done the books on every one of his 15 years of orders and that I could tell him what we charged him in 2011 without looking it up. Then I did. I was within $40. Tom Whitaker looked at me for a long moment. Then he laughed, the way a man laughs when he has just understood something everyone should have told him years ago. He said, "Arthur always did say the smart one worked in the back. He signed for all 9 kitchens before he left the building. $94,000. The biggest order of the year landed by the woman they had tried to move to a patio in Brookline. I sat in the back office after he left, at the metal desk with the green ledger open to the new entry, and I let myself cry for about 2 minutes, not from sadness, from the strange, aching relief of being useful in the daylight, out loud where everyone could see it, after a lifetime of doing it in the back room where no one did. Then I dried my face and I went out to the floor and I told the men we had 9 kitchens coming and nobody was going anywhere. Hector rang the old brass bell Arthur kept bolted by the time clock, the one he only ever rang for big news, a new baby, a big job, the end of a hard year. And the whole shop cheered. I stood there under Arthur's sign in all that noise, and I have never in my life felt closer to my husband than I did right then. He built that bell into that wall with his own hands the year Daniel was born. I do not think he ever imagined it would be his wife ringing it at 71, having just saved the whole thing. Or maybe he did. Maybe that is exactly what he imagined, 6 years ago, in a lawyer's office, while I sat in the waiting room with a magazine I never read. He always could see further than he let on. I want to tell you the rest, because the rest is the part that gave me my life back. And it did not have much to do with Daniel or Sloan at all. It had to do with Emmy. Emmy is my granddaughter, Corinne's girl, and she was 19 that winter, halfway through her second year at the state college, studying business of all things and hating it. She came to stay with me over her winter break because the house was too quiet and I did not want to admit it, and she saw right through me the way she always has. And one gray afternoon, bored, she wandered into Arthur's home office, the little room off the den where he kept his drawings, and she started going through his design books. The sketches for the staircases, the joinery details, the careful pencil drawings of things he had built for people all over the county. And something lit up in that girl that 4 semesters of business school had never once touched. She looked up at me with sawdust in her imagination, if not yet in her hair, and she said, "Grandma, could I see the shop?" So I took her to the shop, and Hector put a scrap of walnut in her hands and showed her how to check the grain, the way Arthur showed Daniel 40 years ago, the way Arthur showed me the summer we met. And I watched my granddaughter fall in love with the thing my son only ever saw as a number. Emmy changed her major that spring. Business, with a focus she designed herself, half management and half the actual craft, learning the floor from Hector 2 days a week and the books from me on Sundays at the kitchen table. The green ledger has a new set of hands turning its pages now. I am teaching her the way Arthur taught me, twice measured, once cut, and never sign anything you have not read to the bottom. She is better at it than I was at her age. She caught an error in a supplier invoice in her third week, a double charge for hinges, $412, and she was so proud of herself she called me from the shop floor to tell me, and I have not been that happy since before Arthur got sick. That spring, Emmy built her first real piece, on her own, in the evenings after the men went home. A small keepsake box, walnut, with a fitted lid, and Arthur's initials worked into the corner joint the way he used to hide them in his furniture, a detail almost nobody would ever notice unless they knew to look. She used his tools, the chisels with the worn handles, the marking gauge with his thumbprint practically pressed into the wood of the handle. She measured it twice, she cut it once, and on the anniversary of the day we lost him, she set it on the kitchen table in front of me, wrapped in plain brown paper, and she said, "It is for the letter, Grandma, for the envelope, so it has somewhere to live." I opened that box at my own kitchen table with my hands shaking the way they had not shaken once in that lawyer's conference room, and I understood that my granddaughter, at 19, had just built the one thing in this whole story worth more than $26 million, a place to keep her grandfather's last words. The envelope lives in that box now. I keep the box in the desk in Arthur's office, and Emmy works at that desk, and so the letter and the girl who will run this company someday sit in the same small room. I think that is exactly the arrangement Arthur was reaching for all along. Corinne comes almost every Sunday now, and she and Emmy and I do the books together at the kitchen table in the afternoon. 3 generations of Merrick women with a ledger and a pot of coffee. That is a sentence I never once got to say in the 49 years Arthur was alive, and I wish he could see it. The daughter who wanted out of Alder Creek drives 2 hours back into it every week. Not for money, she has her own, but because this is where her mother is, and her daughter, and the quiet, stubborn thing her father built. That is what an inheritance actually looks like, not a number split in a conference room, a kitchen table full of people who kept the promise. She is going to run Merrick Millwork someday, and she is going to run it right. And when she does, she will own it outright, because I have already been to see Marion, and the trust now names Emmy as the one who comes after me. Not because she is owed it, because she asked whether Hector would be okay before she asked what she would get. That is the whole test. Arthur knew it. I know it now too. Daniel and I are not what we were. I will not sell you a tidy ending where he learned his lesson and we bake pies together on Sundays. It has been over a year and it is still cool between us, and some of that may never fully thaw, and I have made my peace with that the way you make peace with a winter. But something did shift. After he paid Ostrander's $41,000 and after the shock wore off, Daniel came to the house one evening, alone, without Sloane, without a folder, which was itself a small miracle. He sat at his father's table and he did not ask for anything. He just said, I do not know how I got here, Mom. I do not know when I turned into someone who would do that to Dad. And I told him the truth, which is that I did not fully know either, but that a man is not only the worst thing he ever did, and that the door was not locked, it was just going to open slower than he wanted, because trust is rebuilt at the speed of proof, not the speed of apology. He asked if he could come back to the company, not to own it, just to work. And I said yes on my terms under Hector, doing the actual work, earning back one honest day at a time. He has been there 4 months now. He comes in at 7 with the rest of the men. He does what Hector tells him, and I am told he does it without complaint, which is not the son I watched at that conference table, so perhaps something is happening in there after all. Some days I can see his father in his hands, some days I cannot. We will see. That story is not finished, and I am not going to pretend it is, because real ones rarely are. Sloane, I hear, was not pleased that Daniel took a working man's wage under his mother's roof of a company. I hear there is strain there. I do not celebrate that, but I do not lose sleep over it either. She made her bed on a proposal with tab dividers, and she can lie in it. As for me, the house on Depot Street never went on the market. It is spring again now, the second spring without Arthur, and the maple he planted the year Daniel was born is taller than the roof and just coming into leaf. I did not move to the senior community with the little patio. I stayed in my 4 bedrooms that are too much for one person, and I filled them back up on purpose. Emmy has her old room again for the summer. Corinne comes on Sundays. Hector and his wife came for dinner in February, and we told Arthur stories until midnight, and Hector's wife brought a flan that I have thought about at least twice a week since. The house is loud again some evenings, and I had forgotten how much I missed loud. And once a week, usually on a Tuesday because that is the day I lost him, I take a single armful of flowers from the grocery store, and I put them in a vase on the kitchen table, the one he built, in the light off the maple. For 49 years, I never bought myself flowers. There was always something more sensible to spend it on, a bill, a repair, a thing for one of the children. I am done being sensible at my own expense. I earned that company twice, once with 31 years of books and once with the year I saved it, and I will buy myself flowers on a Tuesday if I please. I still have the envelope, the plain white one with my name on it in Arthur's shaking hand. The letter is still inside it, and the little brass key on its blue ribbon lives beside it in the drawer of the desk in his office, the desk Emmy uses now. Once a year on our anniversary, I take the letter out and I read it all the way to the bottom, the way he taught me to read everything. And every year I stop at the same 2 lines. They just never thought to ask the quiet woman in the back office whose name was on anything. It is yours, Joe. People who hear this story want it to be about revenge. It is not. I took no joy in my son's pale face, or the buyer's cold exit, or Sloane's folder going home unopened. What I felt when the room went quiet and the truth was finally on the table was not triumph. It was recognition. The recognition of a woman who had been looked straight through for most of her life, finally being seen by the one man whose seeing ever mattered, from the other side of the grave. For a whole year, I had been made smaller and smaller, moved to the end of the table, planned around, spoken over, aimed a senior community at like a package that needed forwarding. And the thing that undid all of it was not a scene, or a shout, or a slammed door. It was a single sheet of paper my husband signed 6 years before he died because he had done the one thing none of them ever bothered to do. He had looked at the quiet woman in the back office and seen exactly who she was. My children split $4.2 million in under an hour and thought they had taken everything. They handed me one envelope and told me not to worry about the real assets. But the real assets were never in that pile. The real assets were 31 years of quiet competence that everyone forgot and one man remembered. The real assets were a company full of good men who build beautiful things, and a granddaughter with sawdust in her imagination, and a marriage that trusted me enough to build me a shelter I never even saw going up. They took the money, I got the envelope. And if you ever have to choose, and someday many of you will, choose to be the one worth leaving the envelope to. Be the one who asks whether Hector will be okay before you ask what you will get. Be the quiet one in the back office whose name, when it finally matters, turns out to be on everything. Arthur told me to open mine last. I understand now why. He wanted me to watch them take what they thought was everything, so that I would know, all the way down to the bottom of the page, that the thing he left me was worth more than all of it, and that he had known my worth the whole time, even in the years I had forgotten it myself. That is my story. Thank you for sitting with me through all of it. If it stayed with you, if it made you think of your own quiet woman in her own back office, do me one last kindness and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave me a comment and tell me, if you had to protect one thing in your life from the people who underestimate you, what would it be? I read everyone. And if you have not yet, subscribe, and I will see you next time, here at the kitchen table in the light off the maple. Take care of yourselves, and remember to open yours last.